Today on Everyday Injustice, we have history professor Stuart Schrader. He's at Johns Hopkins University, and his forthcoming book is Blue Power: How Police Organize to Protect and Serve Themselves. So, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us how you got interested in policing and how you came about doing this book.
Well, this is my second book about policing. I don't think I ever thought I would even write one book about policing. But when I was writing my first book, which is called Badges Without Borders, I was looking at the 1960s and starting to notice that police toward the end of the 1960s, as the Johnson administration and others were declaring a war on crime, police started to see that there were some benefits that would accrue to them from a tough on crime posture by elected officials. So they started to actually encourage this tough on crime posture in a sort of self-interested way. They weren't very well organized. They were mostly the police that I was looking at that point were part of a group called the International Association of Chiefs of Police, which has existed. It really started in the late 19th century and continues to this day. It's a membership organization for police chiefs and other high-ranking police officials. It is a truly international organization. It wasn't always, but it is now. They were they were convinced by some of the leaders of that organization to pressure Congress to pass what became the largest federal legislation having to do with crime in 1968. And that really inaugurated at the federal level the war on crime that Johnson was talking about. There was some preliminary legislation a few years earlier, but the 1968 bill was massive. And the International Association of Chiefs of Police continued to maintain relationships with people in Congress, and then Johnson left the White House, Nixon came in. They tried to have a relationship with the Nixon administration. It wasn't always smooth, but the ultimate outcome was that the federal government started pouring money into local police forces through an organization or a kind of arm of the Justice Department called the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. So all of that is just to say that this was something I wrote about in my first book a bit, and I wanted to understand better what were the politics of police. How were they engaging in politics? What were their goals? What were their objectives? Were they doing this type of political lobbying or pressure in other places besides Congress? Obviously, most police are chartered at the city or town level. And this was also at the moment when I was doing this research, when the Police Benevolent Association in New York City, where I was living at the time and currently live, was really at war with the mayor, Bill de Blasio. So a sort of light bulb went off in my head. Again, this wasn't what my first book was about exactly, but a light bulb went off in my head. There must be some connection between this kind of really super antagonistic relationship between the PBA in New York City and the mayor in the second decade of the 2000s, and some of this political lobbying that I had come across in the late 1960s. So long story short, published that other book that was about some other stuff, and started doing this research, and I found, not to pat myself on the back too much, but my hunch was correct. There really was a connection, and there was a really deep and extensive and complex history of police engaging in politics from the 1960s all the way to the present.
Now, just as an aside, what did you do your dissertation on?
Well, yeah, the dissertation that became Badges Without Borders, again, it wasn't originally conceived as a project about police. It was conceived as a project about how the United States influenced the security and law enforcement agencies of other countries, particularly countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and how that influence reverberated back home. Now, the what I found was that there was an extensive effort to influence the police forces of other countries. It wasn't just militaries, and that was what I really honed in on, and that was how I came to work on the police in particular. And that book, charts this history of the United States using police forces of other countries to prevent communist revolution, with some success, many human rights abuses along the way, etc. And then how those practices did come back home and influence what became the war on crime. And the organization I just mentioned, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, it was really consciously modeled on the very program that the United States used to support and influence police in the so-called third world, in the sense that the United States provided resources, provided training, provided materials, and expertise. And that was really what the war on crime consisted of at home, was the federal government providing all of those to local police forces.
So you end up looking primarily at four different locales: Detroit, New York, Baltimore, and Milwaukee. Um,
And San
and
Francisco.
oh, and sorry, I don't have San Francisco on my notes, but that makes sense given everything we've seen in the last 5 years in San Francisco as well. Um, I mean, it seems obvious Detroit and New York and Baltimore, given everything that's kind of happened recently, but why Milwaukee?
Yeah, Milwaukee's an interesting case, and I can't say that, again, before I did the research, I would have thought to look at Milwaukee. I did know that Milwaukee is somewhat famous for having had a socialist in City Hall early in the 20th century. But by the time we get to the 1960s and 1970s, the story in Milwaukee is of an extremely powerful, and this is a direct quote that's in the book, borderline fascist police chief, Harold Breyer. And he was appointed for life. So he could really get away with anything he wanted to get away with. And he was extremely harsh on the civil rights movement in the city. Repression of the civil rights movement was intense, and there was a lot of police violence. But he was also very uh, intense and essentially repressive of the police force itself. And interestingly, I think maybe there's some distant connection to the history of sort of sewer socialism in Milwaukee, but the police union in the city was very well organized, and because it had this antagonistic relationship with a very overbearing chief, it really developed some pretty interesting and powerful tactics to fight with the chief. And not to give too much away about the story, but they come to a sort of accommodation with the chief over time. But they also export to other cities around the country some of their know-how of battling with the chief and also preventing, the chief was opposed to affirmative action. The union wasn't very thrilled about affirmative action. And that was in some sense how they came to start to see eye to eye a little bit more when a group of black police officers sued. So this sort of thing happened in a lot of cities, but it was particularly interesting to see that Milwaukee not only had a really intense battle between the police union and the chief that ultimately, again, came to a sort of resolution, or at least some, uh, you know, tamping down of the antagonism. But the really notable point for me was that these expert police union leaders took the show on the road. And the book actually opens, I think, on the very first page with a cop from Milwaukee who testified on Capitol Hill.
And then Baltimore's an interesting case. I feel like I've read way more about Baltimore than I ever thought I would. I just finished reading the book Homicide, which I think is a decade old at this point, where they were tracking, this homicide squad through a year's worth of cases, including one that never has been resolved. Um, and then of course, the recent issues with all of the corruption in Baltimore. So how do you add to kind of the story that's already emerged in Baltimore?
Yeah, that's a great question. Baltimore is a city that whose police force has gotten a lot of attention because of David Simon and The Wire and Homicide and other works that he's done. But it hasn't been as well. Let me start over again. Uh, But what is a little bit less known than the fact that Baltimore has had a high crime rate and has had a police force that has engaged in sometimes very corrupt and racist activities. What is less well known is that Baltimore was a site of a really crucial kind of fork in the road for the police union movement. In the 1960s, Baltimore did not have a police union. Most cities did not have police unions. They had benevolent associations, they had fraternal organizations, and these were mostly clubs. Sometimes they provided insurance or a credit union or something like that. They were oftentimes we were really just referred to as kind of beer drinking clubs for officers, and oftentimes they would operate bars and so forth. So Baltimore did not have a union, but or even a real association, much like other cities did. But it was a large city. It was an industrial city. It was a city with a strong labor movement, in part because of Bethlehem Steel, which was around that time one of, if not the biggest steel plants in the world. So some union activists affiliated with AFSCME, the which is a largely government employee union, they thought, how does this big city with such a strong labor movement not have a police union? Can we make one happen? At the same time, the Fraternal Order of Police, which was not identified with the labor movement, but was a growing organization across the country, spreading its reach and trying to organize police, although not exactly in the same way that a labor union would. They also saw an opportunity of gaining representation abilities in the city of Baltimore. So what happened was there was a kind of what I would call a three-way fight. The police chief in the city, who was similar to Harold Breyer in Milwaukee in that he was very, very powerful, really did not brook any opposition. He was not open to the police union movement. He thought, well, if there's going to be a representative organization, maybe it should be the Fraternal Order of Police, but they're not going to get a collectively bargained contract, basically over my dead body. They can collect dues, they can use those dues to provide some benefits to officers, and they can confer with me about what officer compensation and other perks should look like. But it's not going to be a collectively bargained union contract. No way. Well, long story short, you get the long story in the book. AFSCME ultimately succeeded in getting enough people to sign union cards, pledges to join the union, that the police chief, Donald Pomerleau, had to recognize them. He couldn't really resist. And there's, a kind of backstory of state and local politics there. The union comes into existence and they have to decide on their first contract. At the same time, the Fraternal Order of Police doesn't totally disappear. It still is trying to kind of maintain its status in the wings. And the union, the AFSCME union, ultimately decides to violate the order of the police chief and go on strike because the initial contract offer that they receive is not what they want. And this comes in the context of other public employee mobilization and a wildcat strike that was already going on by some other workers in the city. Well, this was in some ways the high point of public sector union mobilization among police, meaning AFSCME, this national organization, made inroads among the police in this large city, a city that's really at the cusp of the North and the South. And so they went on strike, and it was a somewhat chaotic situation, as you might imagine, which I detail in the book. But ultimately, what the outcome of it was
And not to interrupt, but normally public safety can't go on strike, so that's
exactly,
interesting in and of itself.
exactly that was what I was about to say. The
Oh, sorry.
outcome was that the police chief said, "You have, violated both my word and the laws of the city, the state, the Lord above," and so the union is no longer going to exist in Baltimore City. So again, the police union in Baltimore City, as being part of AFSCME, this was a real achievement that immediately really blew up in their face. And this ultimately ended up being the last time that AFSCME tried to organize a police union in a big city. They did organize a few other police unions in much smaller cities, say like Albany, New York, which is tiny in comparison to how big Baltimore was in the 1960s. The city started to lose population around this time as well. And like I said, the FOP was waiting in the wings, and eventually the FOP did become the representative union for police in the city, and it remains a very powerful institution in the city all the way up until the present. And to go back to where we started in your question of how Baltimore has become well known kind of nationally, certainly, it came in for a consent decree that was put in place under the Obama administration after the killing of Freddie Gray. There was a lot of recognition of police misconduct and abuse in the city, violations of civil rights and so forth. The FOP has been adamant and defiant in defending the conduct of police in the city. And I think that, and this is true in many places, and this has led to a kind of culture of tolerance for misconduct that has been really difficult to break. And the consent decree was, in some sense, meant to help, you know, undermine or break that culture of tolerance for misconduct and abuse. I think the jury is out to see how effective it will have been. I think we need some time to see, and it's also notable that both the first Trump administration and the second Trump administration are deeply opposed to these types of consent decrees. So their enforcement has been limited, if not lacking entirely.
I'm also wondering, as I look at the list and I start thinking about who's not on the list of cities that you looked into, two that really stand out, and I'm sure there are many more, but and probably the answer is you just couldn't look at all of them. But Philadelphia jumps out at me. They have an interesting history with their union, and of course the LAPD has a long history of corruption and interesting union activities. And I kind of feel bad about calling it a union. My wife always reminds me that it's not a union. She was a labor organizer. They're an association. There's a difference. But what was your thinking in terms of not looking deeper into places like Philadelphia and LA?
Yeah, well, so there's actually another book coming out by a guy named Aaron Beckmeyer about the history of the police union efforts in Philadelphia. He's a friend and a colleague, and I'm looking forward to that book. The question of LA, I think it really deserves its own book. There are some fantastic books about the history of policing in LA. Another friend and colleague, Max Felker Cantor, has a fantastic book about the history of the LAPD. I think, I would say on the one hand, my book is meant to try to give a broad picture of the entire United States over several decades, really from the 1960s to the present. So it's a lot of ground to cover between two covers, so to speak. But yeah, so I couldn't cover every city, and I really do think that yeah, some cities deserve really focused attention, and I hope my book will be an invitation to other authors, historians, scholars, hobbyists to look into these histories. The LA Police Protective League has been really active all the way up until the present. I recently published this article in the New York Review of Books where I talk about some of the ways that police unions across the country have been responding to the ICE and Border Patrol operations by the Trump administration. And what I argue in this piece is that police unions generally have seen these operations and the chaos that they've induced as an opportunity to reignite, if not intensify, fights that they have with local officials. They're using the federal invasions as a kind of leverage point to gain other forms of political leverage in their local politics. So in LA, for example, after the chaos of the ICE operations in June of 2025, the police union was extremely vocal about criticizing every, left-leaning elected official that they could find for their statements and attitudes about what had happened. And so this meant people in Congress, some of whom really had nothing to do with this, AOC, for example, just a kind of bête noire of the right. And then other local officials, some very small scale local officials who, refused to condemn people protesting against ICE, and the police union therefore condemned them for their refusal to condemn protests. So the 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 story that I tell in the book really comes all the way up to the present. Even in the past couple of days, there have been news stories about police in New York City getting pelted by snowballs, and the police unions have weighed in on this and really used it as an opportunity to say that the new mayor, Zoran Mamdani, who is a democratic socialist, is somehow responsible for police getting pelted with snowballs and needs to, take a stand here. So, the use of particular, news headlines for political gain is a really common tactic that police unions have, and I show throughout the book that this has been something that's been going on for quite some time in many different places.
And I was going to go there anyway. What do you believe after doing all this research is at the heart of the political leverage of police unions? And I say that, and let me couch my terms a little bit just to make it easier. But, it seems like the police union influence has persisted even as other unions have declined in their power. And I have in my own mind my answer, but I'm really interested in your answer on that.
Well, I'd be interested to hear your answer as well. I think you're exactly right, and I try to show this in the book that on the one hand, if we charted this as a kind of two lines, you would see the power of police unions, increasing, going up on the y-axis, and the power of other unions, certainly private sector unions, but also public sector unions, going down on the y-axis. There would be a real divergence if we could somehow quantify the power and influence that they have. Although none of this is permanent. I think we are also living through over the past decade a resurgence of the labor movement to some degree, but not getting back to the heights that it had earlier in the 20th century. Why does the police union movement maintain so much power and influence in contrast to these other unions? Well, I think that they are very, very effective at using a lot of the tools that made the traditional labor movement quite, powerful. Have learned a ton. They really studied from, lessons from organized labor. They get out the vote. They make campaign contributions. They are consistent in speaking out, holding press conferences, mobilizing their members to rallies, et cetera, et cetera. So those are all things that the organized labor movement is able to do and does do. They've also benefited from what I would call, since the 1960s, a bipartisan consensus that has begun to fray a bit in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movements of 2014, 2015, and then again 2020, but a bipartisan consensus that elected officials, in order to be viable, need to be tough on crime. They need to make sure to provide both rhetorical support for law enforcement and material support. It has kind of become, a kind of unquestioned factor that has really shaped American politics in this period. That if you're soft on crime, you will lose. And this is the kind of you lose an election. This is kind of taken for granted. Now, how does this relate to police unions? I think it kind of goes both ways. On the one hand, police unions are there to enforce the sentiment, make sure that that elected officials hold the sentiment that they need to be tough on crime or else. So they put pressure, including sometimes through threats, extortion, blackmail, etc. But then, on the other hand, they also are, the recipients of the benefits that come from that, in the form of, strong contracts, large budgets, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the third point, which I kind of just suggested, is that police are able to engage in forms of political activity that other individuals and organizations cannot, because they would be seen to be violating the law. So, making threats, engaging in intimidation, otherwise, you know, protesting and rallying in ways that are, kind of flouting the law. All of those are tactics that police can and do engage in that would lead to severe consequences for other types of organizations and unions. But for police, they're able to get away with it. I mean, I think that many people will probably remember in 2020 when the Sergeants Benevolent Association in New York City doxed the daughter of Mayor de Blasio after she was arrested in a protest. And I mentioned this toward the end of the book as an incident that really, in some ways, crystallizes the way that police union tactics and objectives have strayed quite far from what we would consider the tactics and objectives of the traditional labor movement. The traditional labor movement is concerned with issues like workplace safety, compensation, other forms of working conditions, and so forth. There's also a growing social justice component to the labor movement, where there are demands for broader, changes that would lead to, freedom, equality, and liberation. But on the whole, the labor movement is not attacking the kids of their political antagonists, whereas the leader of the Sergeants Benevolent Association at that time, in part because he was trying to force a better contract deal with the mayor, but in part because he was also engaged in a form of politics that really had nothing to do with compensation, and was really just a kind of form of vengeance against what he saw as an illegitimate, push for constraining the power of police and criticizing police made by protesters. And, his argument was that it was the mayor's fault that this type of protest was happening, which of course was totally ridiculous. If anything, it was the fault of police, because George Floyd was murdered by a police officer, and that was what touched off the protest wave.
So my theory is similar to yours, but maybe a bit more visceral. And kind of the flag is Willie Horton. And why is Willie Horton so important? Well, he's just one example, so just make that clear. But basically, the idea, and for those who are too young to remember it, Willie Horton was this ad in 1988 that was used to falsely show that presidential candidate Michael Dukakis was soft on crime. And basically, it comes down to, the difference between labor and the police is that, labor can argue, hey, we need more fairness, we need this, we need that. Police will argue, hey, if you don't pay us enough or you don't do what we want, crime's going to go up, and somebody is going to get killed. And that is the threat level, right? And even if you look at 2020, everything turned around when police started saying, hey, we're going to stop arresting people because we don't want to get accused of being racist. And then, coincidentally, the crime's going up because of COVID. And so all of a sudden, the criminal justice reform movement itself stalls because people are all of a sudden afraid of crime, or they're afraid that, of these viral videos that come out showing, all these people raiding stores and all of this theft, and they blame it on the lack of police. And so the police have this leverage point over everyone. They have it over politicians because they can influence politicians' future, or at least they can credibly claim to the electorate. So that's my theory.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like the theory that you've developed is influenced by what I read about in Blue Power, because yeah, police have engaged in various forms of withdrawals of their labor, from the so-called blue flu, calling in sick en masse, to ticket writing slowdowns, to wildcat strikes. This has been occurring from the 1960s all the way through to the present. Arguably, to this day, we're still living through a kind of nationwide slowdown. So, the maybe the one maybe asterisk that I would add to this, however, is that it's not quite clear that the withdrawal of police labor leads to a spike in crime. If anything, there's a lot of evidence that it does the opposite. Now, that can raise a question about, is crime, quote unquote, occurring objectively, or is it only occurring when it gets measured, counted, and recorded? It's a kind of, tree falling in a forest with no one to hear it sort of thing. And that's a difficult question to answer, and many social scientists have tried to figure that out. But nevertheless, it is the case that it doesn't seem clear that every time there is a slowdown or blue flu or whatever, that crime does spike. So I also would say that I am not certain that going forward from the present, police will be able to maintain the same type of leverage. I think that there is a possibility for elected officials to kind of call their bluff. I think it remains to be seen whether that will happen. Many elected officials do remain quite terrified of these types of threats. They are terrified of the type of negative campaigning that you referenced, like the Willie Horton ad used against Michael Dukakis. But interestingly enough, George H.W. Bush, who ostensibly succeeded in that election in part because of that vicious racist campaign, he was no real friend to police. So police didn't really get what they wanted out of him. It took another person to give them what they wanted, whose name was Joe Biden, when he was in the Senate. And then ultimately Bill Clinton as the president.
I was going to blame Clinton, but yeah, no, and
well, they work together.
yeah, and just to be clear, I did say perceive. So yeah, no, I
Yeah,
grant.
yeah,
I don't agree. Like I said, I believe that crime went up in 2020 and 2021 because of COVID, not because of changes in policing.
yeah,
So I just
yeah.
wanted
I
to be
agree with
clear on
that too.
that point.
Yeah.
So we are out of time. I could probably talk to you all day about this topic. I think it's really fascinating. And so I look forward to your book coming out in late April, the
Mid-April.
26th, right?
Mid-April 26th.
Oh,
Yep.
mid-April. Okay. So Blue Power, and I may grab your previous book before then. Thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks. This was great.
We've been talking with Stuart Schrader. His book is Blue Power: How Police Organize to Protect and Serve Themselves. This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system.